Well, what a pleasure to welcome back Pascal Lottaz, who happens to be now one of our alumni. And Pascal, greetings from London and Durham to you, and welcome back to BRI Dialogues.
Ali and Anush, thank you very much for having me back on your channel.
Well, I have to say that the world has changed since we had you on the program last time. And I want to ask you this question, Pascal, in the context of these tariff wars, the tantrums, the trade wars. You have spent a great deal of time in your research and work on neutrality. And we have countries like Singapore and, many in Southeast Asia, some in Middle East like Oman. But when the push comes to shove, which we're still in the early days, we still have another 3.5 years, if not more, with Donald Trump. Is the spirit of neutrality under threat? Is it going to come to with us or against us? Not that China will bring this to the fore, but United States will now make a deeper demarcation in international affairs. Is the spirit of neutrality and the sanctity of neutrality under fracture, under pressure, and where are we going?
The spirit of neutrality or the idea of neutrality is always under pressure. And I'm gonna make this claim, though, that the current period right now, although we see huge pressures on countries to choose sides, is actually more conducive to neutrality than the 30 years prior to 2022. Neutrality usually flourishes in multipolar setups the most because there is most conflict potential towards which third parties will want to keep a arm's length distance in one way or another. The most unconducive system is one of global hegemony, one of unipolarity, in which there, especially when there is one single force that implements its vision of world politics. Because if it sounds contradictive, but neutrality is a reaction to conflict. So the less conflict, the less neutrality, and neutrality fades away. And don't understand me wrong. I don't think that's a good thing. And neutrality is neither a good thing nor a bad thing. It is simply an approach to deal with the conflicts of others. Now, by the very fact that we are now seeing more conflicts, and we see them on various levels, right? We see violent conflicts, the worst of the worst at the moment, of course, between Israel and Palestine, or like the genocide on the Palestinians in Gaza. But we see them in traditional warfare, kind of First World War style trench warfare, the way that the Ukraine-Russia war is developing, although that one also has many levels, and at least one of them is the indirect warfare between the United States and Russia. But all of that has now created so many pressure points that we see that certain states gave up their neutrality, right? Finland and Sweden, most importantly. But this is also something very normal to happen. Every war, every conflict destroys a couple of neutrals, but it usually births some neutrals again. The Napoleonic Wars gave birth to modern Swiss neutrality. The First World War, then the little warfare, or little conflicts in the 19th century gave birth to things like the Belgian neutrality, Luxembourg's neutrality. The First World War killed those, but gave rise again to neutralities like the Irish neutrality, and the Second World War and the aftermath gave rise to Austrian neutrality and Yugoslav non-alignment. They gave the Cold War dichotomy, gave birth to the whole non-aligned movement in general, which is a genuinely new form of this third-party politics, as I tend to call it now. And what we are seeing at the moment is that the increased pressure that the United States is putting on various places in the world, also with its tariffs, is actually creating more counter reaction, not necessarily into the arms of Russia and China, but into this idea that, oh, God damn it, maybe we have to do something on our own. I mean, even in Japan, which for the longest time has been looking at itself as as the United States' most loyal ally in Asia, is now seriously angry with what is coming from Washington, and this is not the first time. This is like they've experienced this time and again, and I don't think that Japan is going to declare its neutrality tomorrow. But Japan is now, for the first time, seriously thinking about what kind of alternative connections can we, what kind of alternatives do we have to the United States? And these are actually political developments that are conducive toward well, neutrality in general, although do not understand neutrality as just what Switzerland and Austria does. It's not just permanent neutrality. It is this entire idea of, okay, I'm not going to be an ally of either. I'm going to do my own thing. I'm just going to be I'm going to do have my own case for myself, and I'm not going to throw myself into this conflict of my partners. And you always think of them as partners, even or as friends, even if they are the unfriendly kind. So it's the most normal thing that in conflict parties put a lot of pressure on neutrals because you want them to be on your side. And especially the stronger part of a conflict usually puts most pressure on neutrals because they have the highest chance to convince them, whereas the weaker party usually has more to win of keeping them neutral, right? So this dynamic also is traditional. And we see right now how the United States is actually thinking about using these tariffs, which by now have more morphed into sanctions than anything else, at least when it comes to China. How they have this idea of using secondary tariffs, secondary sanctions on third states to convince them to be in their camp. It's a very traditional dynamic, and it's going to work on some states, and it's going to fail on others. And it's so the dynamic hasn't changed. Just the methods to implement are have new names.
Pascal, that is absolutely spot on. So to spin what you're saying in a different way. So it's true that some countries will come kind of flourish out of this through neutrality, but MAGA bullying is also making the world more insecure. So while Japan may be looking for, say, neutrality, it is also rearming itself, and that adds to insecurity around its neighborhood. Well, I've been looking at the impact of MAGA bullying around the world, and I see that there are maybe Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and Europe, the three conflict zones, if you like, are responding differently to MAGA bullying. In Europe, Germany's rearming is kind of multilateral, is trying to integrate within a European context, draw Britain back into the European defense theater, UK as well into that setup. Japan is trying to deal with China as a kind of a cold ally, is trying to draw closer to India at the same time. It is now trying to revisit the legacy with Korea, Japanese imperialism and so on, while it is rearming itself. So that's one question that I would love to hear your views on. The other is India. India has been, if you like, the guru of neutrality for a long time. But MAGA bullying is putting in front of it some very unpalatable choices. How do these Asian giants, not looking at China yet, manage this chaos that MAGA bullying has created?
Wonderful questions. Maybe let me start with Japan first. Japan decided to put more stress and more emphasis on its on rearmament almost 2 years ago in early 2023 when they decided to or spring or summer 2023 when they decided to first change their doctrine when it comes to missile defense. They had a 100% defensive defense doctrine, which said the only way we use missiles is to shoot down incoming missiles of other states. They changed that doctrine to saying like, no, we will also, if push comes to shove, we will also shoot at the bases from which missiles are shot at us. And that was interpreted 2 years ago as Japan escalating its military doctrine, which in a sense it is. On the other hand, the doctrine still says clearly, we will only do that once missiles have been fired. We will not preemptively fire at anyone else. And the Japanese are first and foremost not thinking of China, they think of North Korea. One thing that needs to be understood is that Japan is highly, highly scared of North Korea, even more so than China, because with China, at least from the conversations that I hear in Japan, like people kind of think that they understand the Chinese, and that with the Chinese you have a way of rationalizing and be rational with them. North Korea has very successful managed of looking like a madman, and the Japanese perceive it as a madman. So they are very scared of a North Korean nuclear missile just from one day to another for no good reason, suddenly flying toward Tokyo. They are seriously scared of that. Even though I think this scare is overblown, and North Korea actually has behaved relatively rational within their way of very belligerent and bellicose rhetoric, but they've been doing things their military and foreign policy in rather predictable ways. So I am not that scared of them, but what my perception doesn't matter. The perception of the Japanese matters. The perception of also how the the Japanese government needs to signal to its population that we keep you safe. Now, when it comes to China, the biggest problem is that there are these disputes with islands, right? And that's actually also something that the relationship with Korea has in common. Korea and China both have disputes over islands, over a couple of rocks in the East China Sea, and that creates enormous tension between them because it's this zero-sum game. It's ours or it's theirs. I must say, Japan, South Korea, and China actually managed this conflict in a sense that it is clear which island is under whose administration. So while the Japanese still claim a couple of islands that South Korea administers, they do not try to change that administration by force, and the Chinese are not trying to change by force the fact that Japan administers the Senkaku, or what they call the Diaoyu Islands. So there is this kind of, in the same way that China has managed its border disputes with Russia and also with India, actually, there's also a form of implicit understanding of how to manage the border dispute in the East China Sea. Actually, also Taiwan Taiwan also claims the Diaoyu Islands, so it's actually a trilateral dispute, but. Taiwan has other problems, bigger problems, in fact. And the fear over here is, of course, that misperceptions will lead to an escalation. The good thing is that also 2 years ago, China and Japan actually opened a hotline between the two ministries of defense, so that the ministers of defense can now pick up the phone and talk to each other immediately, if necessary, in order to figure out if some accident in the East China Sea was meant to be or not, so that at least the chances for unintentional escalation gets a little bit dampened. When 2 years ago this decision was made to first change the doctrine and secondly also increase the military budget from 1% to 2% of GDP, that was heralded in the United States as this moment when Japan finally rethinks its security strategy, and they used all of these euphemisms. Oh, Japan for the longest time has been the shield, and the United States the sword, and now Japan is also becoming a sword in the fight against evil China and China, right? On the one hand, it is true that now Japan is rearming and is gaining capabilities that it didn't have before, especially also like offensive ones, and making these weapons internally. That's the most important one, right? Making them at home, not being dependent on imports from the United States. Now, until this rearmament actually has anything close to actual power, it will still take several years. Of course, China perceives this as a problem and a threat. And the United States perceives that as a great victory because finally the ally is helping more. There is, though, a second school of thought in Japan, the ones that says that we do this because the United States is an unreliable partner. So we have the ones that want to support the United States even more in the bilateral agreements. We have the people who say, like, we need to be prepared to be abandoned. And this these two schools do not really fight with each other. They are not opposed to each other. They more work in tandem. And this tandem now, through the actions of the United States, lends more credibility to the side that says, look, we need indigenous capabilities. The biggest problem in my perception and that the Japanese have is that they are not aware of how scary they look to the outside. To them, it is China that's the scary one. China is obviously a threat, right? But a lot of Japanese don't understand that in China, you look at Japan as this entity that raped and plundered and pillaged and killed millions of your people only 80 years ago. And Japan never had the Willy Brandt moment of, asking for forgiveness in Poland, in Warsaw, right? They never had that, unfortunately. So the threat in East Asia is, to me, the biggest one. If we just take the East Asian countries, is escalation due to misperceptions on all sides. But the factor of the United States is one that actually pushes for this if possible. And we see how in Taiwan, the United States is working on, propping up and encouraging, let's say, the forces that want to make the island independent. So I'm worried about the American factor very much. So that's the situation here. So I see the one more thing I need to mention is that if I now compare the way of the rhetoric in Europe about rearmament and the rhetoric in Japan, I hear less belligerency. Japan kind of is now, at least what I hear from around here, is we rearm out of necessity. We don't rearm in order to prepare for a war that we want to do. And there is, to me, no hatred either towards the Chinese nor towards the Russians. It's more like it's genuine threat that they perceive. Whereas the Europeans at the moment, I feel a lot of this Russophobia that fuels this rearmament drive, then these unrealistic assessments of what the Ukraine war has been about, and also an unrealistic assessment of what Europe even can achieve. And you see in newspapers and so on, and a drive not just to rearm, but to remilitarize and make all of these interviews with like young people. Oh, would you want to defend your country? Would you sign up to the army? And then young girls who in interviews say like, oh yes, I am not a nationalist, but I'm a patriot, and patriots defend their countries. This is bizarre. This is very bizarre to me in German media at the moment. So it is also psychological militarization. And I would argue that in Japan we don't have that element, at least nowhere near to the level where the Europeans are psychologically militarizing. Here it's more a question of like creating capabilities. That's not a question of making the population, readying them psychologically to be willing or ready to have a war. So that about Japan. About India, India has been a champion of the non-aligned movement, and India for the longest time, also when it comes to the war in Ukraine, has time and again told the Europeans and the Americans that India is going to do its own foreign policy, and they will continue buying oil from Russia because this is good for India, and India will do what's in its interest, which is this form of kind of independent third state neutrality policy, even though they don't call it a neutrality policy, but it's this we do what's good for us. At the same time, India has also been integrating with a couple of initiatives from the United States, most importantly the QUAD, right? The Americans call it an alliance, but it's more of a cooperation, a military cooperation forum, and the Indians haven't been shy of engaging in that because they do have border disputes with China. But the Indians and the Chinese, they are way more pragmatic and way more nuanced when it comes to international relations, because at the same time, as they have border disputes in Kashmir and their soldiers throw stones at each other because they both have a policy not to use weapons, but they do quarrel seriously. They also are part of BRICS, right? They cooperate in one level while they dispute in others, and this is something that the European and American model doesn't do, right? It's black and white in this case, right? You're either with us or against us. You either fight Russia or you're with Russia, and East Asian and South Asian countries have had much less of that. They compete. They even use military force to a certain extent, but they are willing to still cooperate in other levels. And in this sense, India has had a much more nuanced foreign policy, and I foresee that this will continue, because I don't see any reason why they would completely shift into one or the other camp. There's no also the disputes. They're not changing their nature at the moment. The question is what these larger East Asian and South Asian countries will do with the smaller ones around them. I just had a talk with the great Sri Lankan scholar Asoka Bandarage, and she keeps saying, look, India is starting to, has been and is still treating us the way that the Brits used to treat Sri Lanka when it was under colony. Not in the same way, but smaller states around India still do feel the might of this giant. So it's the question is rather, do these larger ones then try to convince the smaller ones around them to actually pick sides, and will other powers try to take advantage of that? Because Sri Lanka, for instance, is in a very pivotal geostrategic space, and whether you see how the Chinese try to have ports there, and how Sri Lanka tried to give ports to other powers, and we see these regime change operations there as well. These smaller states are now are definitely being disputed. I don't think that anything like that can be pulled off in India, although I might be wrong about this. We've seen how the United States was actually involved also in the regime change operation with getting rid of Imran Khan 2.5 years ago in Pakistan, and that was a very big one. But I do think from my talks to Indian colleagues that India got the message that they have to be careful of what they do internally, and this constant threat of all of these NGOs and so on is there. But for the time being, and ever since independence, I think India has shown that it has an enormous resilience and ability to track its own course, and I believe this will continue.
I could not help but to start visualizing when you and Anush were deliberating and talking, and given the somber moments at the moment in Vatican, and the passing of Pope Francis, I was thinking that if today there was a funeral for the international rules-based order, and the international rules-based order was in the coffin, would people pass by with somber mood, or would be celebrating that this international rules-based order has passed away? And what is being born? Are we going to see an international rules-based law? And I would love to have your thoughts on that, between the difference between an order that a diktat and law that everybody has to adhere to. And you talked about perception of threat in case of Japan. And one of the words that I think we overlook in our discussions is relevance, and the relevance of a state. Today, when you look at the erosion of trust and credibility of the United States, the fractured international rules-based order, in that context, in your view, what is emerging? How quickly this new law-based order can be born in such a fractured, multipolarized set of aspirations and interests? And does Europe truly understand that it's part of Eurasia? And why doesn't the penny drop? And if you want to build on that, I would love to have your thoughts.
Yeah, well, let me start with the last one first, because that answer is very easy. No, the Europeans have still not understood, after these hundreds of years, that they are the Western Peninsula of Eurasia. They just don't comprehend it. In the European mind, you've got Europe, then you've got Russia, and then it gets blank and white, and then there's China. And in order to go to China, you need a boat or an airplane to fly around, right? And most Europeans don't understand that Google Maps can literally give you turn-by-turn directions of how to walk from Porto, Portugal to Singapore. or Vladivostok for that matter. This is one connected landmass. Singapore isn't, but there's a bridge, so you can walk to Singapore. But you get the point, right? It's like this is one connected landmass, and it has been a connected landmass, and you've had trade routes through by land. Admittedly, it's usually more cost efficient to ship them via the sea, but you've always had the Silk route. Also had a land component going through the Middle East, going through Iran, and then the Middle East, and all the way to Europe. That was always there. It's just that the Europeans conceptualize themselves differently. They don't want to be, not only they don't want it, they are so conditioned to thinking of themselves as different that they lost the ability to comprehend their geographical location. They perceive themselves as more American, this transatlantic idea, right? That this is one thing that belongs together. Then they see themselves as Eurasians, which of course they are. And Eurasia as a landmass actually has exactly the same problems all over the place, from Europe all the way to China, which is like multi-ethnic, multinational, multilingual groups of people who, with various religions, that on very small spaces have to live together, and that has created problems time and again. And the Europeans are still at this moment, a lot of them would just shake their head at my description, would say, no, we're so different, China, so completely different, and that we belong together across the continent is something that's just not there in terms of consciousness. So that's one thing. Then the rules-based international order, I would say, well, let me speak for myself. I'm glad it's stillborn. It's now sunk in that this terminology is going away, even the people who propagated it. But be under no, don't be fooled. The rules-based international order is a recent terminology. That came up in the last 10 or so years, first a little bit and then more and more, because the United States and Europe stopped talking about international law. They needed a new concept in order to pretend, first and foremost to their own populations, that they are in adherence with the rules-based international order, and that there is an order, and that they keep up the order, and whatever they do is in support of the order. But they never gave us the book. They never gave us the order. They never gave us the okay, here, these are the rules. So where are the goddamn rules? They just make up rules, not as they go. They pick and choose. So Ambassador Chas Freeman on my channel put this really, really well when he analyzed that this international rules-based order is a very old concept of the rule by law instead of the rule of law. The rule by law, you use laws that you propagate, but you pick and choose, and you apply them in certain contexts and in others not. And we have all of these concepts from way back. I mean, just think about sovereignty of a state. Yes, the sovereignty is sacred, but the right to self-determination of peoples. And depending on the situation, the West says, we support the right of self-determinations of the Albanians in Kosovo. It's very important. It is a principle of the rules-based international order. But when in Ukraine, in the Donbass, people stands up and says we want our right to self-determination, then the West goes, no, you cannot do that because the sovereignty of the state is the most sacred of the rules in the rules-based international order. So we just help to keep up the rules, and we pick and choose which one in which case. So there's no generality, right? The whole idea of the rule of law is that you state the rules, and then they apply equally to everybody, including yourself, including everybody else. And that's, of course, the idea of international law. And international law has been with us, depending on when you put the starting point, either 400 years or 1,000 years. Or some of these rules are even earlier. And these are not rules, these are principles, and these are norms. And the good news I have is that while the international rules-based order is this now dead baby on the floor, which everybody accepts, and I'm glad about it, what we're seeing is a return of the idea that we go to international law, because it's worth reminding ourselves what the one thing is that nobody disputes. I mean, everybody is unhappy with the United Nations, but nobody ever disputes its importance. China and Russia constantly keep saying that we want to work through the United Nations and we adhere to the UN Charter, even while having violent conflicts. The Russia actually has an explanation for everything they did, which they are able to frame under the UN Charter and Article 51 and self-defense and collective self-defense. I mean, they have a whole legal argument that makes everything they do, that gives it coherence under the UN Charter. Whether you believe that or not is another question, but they do it, right? They're not trying to say, like, we don't give a damn. The UN Charter doesn't apply to us. No, they say, like, it does apply and we're in adherence with it, and here's why. And then the Europeans and the Americans, no, you're not. Even the United States doesn't actually, while it tries to block the UN at every point and turn, it so far hasn't contemplated withdrawing, and it doesn't actually try to have a rhetoric against it, right? It never tries to say, like, UN Charter doesn't apply to us anymore. They always make up phony excuses why what they're doing is in accordance with the UN Charter. And while this is a sad thing to do, it's also a hopeful thing, because it tells us that the norms of international law still govern the thinking of people, and of massive numbers of people, especially of the people in the administrations and so on, who actually know the rules and studied them and went through these trainings and these courses. And this is something that apparently we don't want to get rid of. We rather want to develop it, right? So we are, if anything, then we're going back to an earlier version of a rules-based international order, but under international law, an international law-based order, which always, we have never had a moment when international law perfectly worked and everything was fine. But we've never had a moment when, at least so far, when people started saying, I don't care about international law anymore, and I'm going to tell people about it. We've always had a moment when states said, well, we want to do X. How do we sell that under international law? And then brought out the lawyers and told them, come here and tell me how I can square this circle. And then they start going and do things, like just war and, preemptive strikes in order to prevent and collective self-defense, but they frame it under this. And I see that's what's in store for us. And, so in a sense, it's a return to international law.
So staying on the same train then, Pascal, if you compare, say, the Biden period with the MAGA period, Trump too, this is now kind of unmanaged decline of a superpower, if for want of a better term. Unlike Biden, who was trying to maintain American power, but concede at the margins as much as was possible to digest domestically. Trump doesn't respect American law, let alone international law. Everything he's doing is against the American Constitution by and large. Given that the mess that we're in, and that this is now a managed decline, one turns to countries like China, who have built their entire prosperity on multilateralism and international law. And it's very interesting that China is now the carrier of the international law flag. They don't talk about a rules-based order, as you rightly say. They respect international law. But the corridors of international legal power are still dominated by the Atlanticists, right? So who does China work with if the Americans are now throwing all the toys out of the pram, and the Europeans are terrified of China, and India doesn't have the instruments to play at that high stake table? How do the Chinese manage to take us through this next step of governance, international governance, for want of a better term?
Well, by building it, right? And you can see that how China, together with India, Brazil, Russia, South Africa, they took an idea that was basically the idea of an economist. Oh, look at these 5, 6 countries together. They have so much GDP. I mean, they're going to be a force to be reckoned with. And they took that idea and actually said, like, how about we sit together and we do what the G7 did, which is we don't create a formal club. We just do policy coordination. And to some extent harmonization together, and we don't create strict a strict handbook of what has to be adhered to and what not, because that's the way to ruin ourselves. Because of course we have different interests, but we can agree that we want to go in a similar direction. And then they create a bank, and they create a development bank, which still has a long way to go to be structurally as important as the IMF or the World Bank, but it's being worked on, and now working on alternative payment systems in order to allow for easier cross-border trade. And together with that, you will have to create a couple of basic rules. But then again, we have these rules already, right? We have the principles and the norms of reciprocity, of making treaties with each other, and these treaties gonna continue. We can see even in the realm of security, how Russia is striking security agreements with North Korea and with Iran, right? And an agreement that is not a direct alliance, but that creates a certain understanding of how these states want to cooperate, and they do it in the way that has been done for centuries or millennia, right? With treaties and with agreements, and these agreements at one point or another also need to have dispute settlement mechanisms. And we need a new. The World Trade Organization, for instance, has been checkmated by the United States, which refuses to appoint judges to the appellate court. Therefore, the thing cannot really work anymore. But I would suppose that there will be either a BRICS kind of equivalent or an alternative, or what we are seeing at the moment, actually, which also works, is the natural not emergence, the natural tendency to use again arbitration, international arbitration under international law. And there's more and more of these cases, and my friend in Tokyo, who's an arbitration lawyer, tells me, yeah, there's work coming in on a weekly basis. And this arbitration law is very well developed, and the Chinese use it as much as the Swiss and the Americans do, actually, because it's based on this consensual approach that, well, if you start dealing with each other, you delineate how you will in the future adjudicate disputes, and that system actually also works. So this is something that I believe we will also go to. And when you say that China alone has the capacity, then what you're talking about is the power, right? The military and economic
enforcement, Pascal.
Enforcement, yes. Enforcement is always a problem, but even during the unipolar moment of the United States wasn't able to enforce everything it wanted. And I don't see the China surpassing the unipolar moment in terms of what they can do anytime soon. Although they are a great power, a superpower, I mean, for sure. But we must not underestimate just the cumulative effect of certain states opposing what the superpower does. And in one area, for instance, is the China is trying to carve out space in the East and South China Sea that it says, that should be under our. Well, we should be the maritime enforcers here, right? Not even our military, but our maritime the Coast Guard ships should be patrolling these islands all the way to the Philippines over there, and these rocks and features. And this is something that Southeast Asian countries don't accept. This is carving out of basically a national territory in international waters is something that they don't want, and they use UNCLOS and so on. And the Philippines used UNCLOS in order to have a legal dispute with China. And China, the only thing they could do is not participate in it and say, like, we don't recognize that. But the Philippines is celebrating this as a victory of, being together with the majority that doesn't want this to happen, which is also a very great powers trying to carve out spaces in international waters is a very traditional thing to happen. The Brits tried it, the Americans tried it, and all of them, even the greatest powers, failed just because the cumulative effect of a lot of lateral states that do not agree kind of had the longer they had more. They could keep this on for longer, and therefore the norm that states can possess large parts of open water never became a norm. And this way of development of the rules, I foresee continuing now, which also means that we don't always have resolution mechanisms. And so the most important thing that the Chinese could help us with is to create new mechanisms for resolution and use old resolution mechanisms, and maybe have more consensual means of global management. For instance, a norm that was around in a Sinocentric world used to be the concept of suzerainty. Not sovereignty, but suzerainty. That you have a power here, and you have independent states over here, and they do their own thing, but they're still tethered to the main part. But you don't have clear divisions, the clear roles. The clear divisions is a very European concept. Again, A or B, black or white, with us or against us. Sovereignty in this sense is a very European concept, and maybe a concepts that more work with overlapping jurisdictions and overlapping and gradual transitions into also legal systems is maybe something that would help us more on the Eurasian continent than this sovereignty, clear-cut sovereignty. In a sense, think about the way in which there currently is no war between China and Taiwan, or between the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China. These two entities are currently not, there's no bombs dropping for the last 60 years, 65, 70 years. No bombs have been dropping. They are still de jure in some sort of state of war, although this is unclear because the People's Republic says we defeated the Republic and we are the successor state. The Republic of China, Taiwan says no, you didn't. We're still here, and we have this blurry line. But the fact that it's blurry and it's peaceful helps us to maintain stability, right? So sometimes it's better not to have a clear-cut solution, because in order to get to that, you need a war. And in this sense, maybe China's role can be to help us, to infuse us with more of these consensual means of maybe not creating harmony, but managing conflict non-violently.
Pascal, the past few weeks since we had you on the program have been a nightmare for market makers, for trading companies, for multinationals. The tantrum of tariffs, as you rightly said, which are turning into secondary, tertiary sanctions to an extent, are causing havoc in supply chains and everywhere else. This time around, as you rightly said, China was prepared, and China is matching everything that America is applying. It looks like a poker game, which the bluff is coming to the table finally, and China is putting more chips, whether it's rare earths, whether it's supply chains, whether it's saying, okay, you want to play tough, play tough. In this context, if United States loses the commercial trade credibility chips as well, given that it has already lost a lot of international rules-based order, geopolitical credibility from Iraq to Afghanistan and many other theaters that are sadly still continuing. What is left for United States, and how will China be able to capitalize on that to accelerate what Anush was talking about as a new architecture? And how dangerous is it for US to continue pushing only to be backpedaling, which is a lot of analysts are saying with treasury bills. I mean, there's a leakage. Canada has started using leverage finance as well. Mark Carney is a man of finance and banking. If China starts the same, the cost of borrowing, the cost of financing of the United States, domestic challenges, what will be left for US to keep this coherence that it has created in a unipolar world? And is this a poker game with the highest stakes in American history, in your opinion?
I think so. I mean, the United States is a funny country. It's a country with a lot of ingenuity and a lot of ideas of how to structure things. And the United States, for the last more than 100 years, the last 200 years, has been actively involved in building and creating norms and creating institutions around the world. And they're also always the first ones to tear them down. they're the ones to come up with the Bretton Woods system and beg it and tethering the US dollar to gold and then other currencies to the US dollar, and then they're the first ones to cut the thread and destroy that system again. In a sense, it's creative destruction or first mover destruction. But I think what we're seeing this time is that they're taking down so many pillars of what their hard and soft power had been built on, that I seriously think they're undermining their case. And while the Biden administration, as you correctly pointed out, tried to cling to hegemony, the Trump administration is tearing it down without being completely aware that that's what he's doing. At least that's how I see it. Let's not forget that a large part of US power was soft power, right? And even that one is being taken down. So the way that the US now treats its students and starts just, kicking foreigners out, even foreigners with green cards, just from one day to another, revoking these green cards and these rights that were perceived as given in this country, that this is gone. And that the US education system, which for better or worse was still like very popular abroad, with Chinese and Indians and Europeans and so on flocking into these elite universities because those were the best around. And now you understand that if you're a foreigner in one of these institutions, you can be kicked out from one day to another. So this sabotages that soft power, and they do that on so many fronts, with the credibility, also with market access. And what they're now teaching the world is that they can cut you off from market access, and probably countries will survive. One of the largest drivers of international relations is also the belief that you need the US market, and they're now working actively on pushing other countries away and then making them learn the lesson. Okay, probably I can survive. I mean, can you remember how we all thought we couldn't survive if we cannot go to the office? And then during Corona, we learned, no, the world can continue. We need to do it differently. It wasn't a nice lesson, wasn't a good lesson, but it was a lesson. And we are now learning a lesson that the United States is not what even the most ardent supporters of it thought it was. Yeah. And this, of course,
reminds me of Gloria Gaynor's song. Next time at UN Assembly, they will play "I Will Survive."
Yeah, yeah. The US is tearing down its structural importance, and by overplaying its hand, because even as a superpower, you can only be so and so tough, or only very tough to very few. If you're very tough to a lot, then, well, the others are going to just leave you. Again, nobody likes a bully, and they've never been more clear on this than now. So all China needs to do is to be the nice guy. It's to be kind and help and maybe help out. And they try that very hard. The coup, the diplomatic success they had with brokering a resumption of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The way that they were the most constructive when it came to trying to broker something with Ukraine, by not imposing but by giving ideas and offering themselves. The way that China is offering itself in Southeast Asia, and while everybody understands that this is, of course, not just out of pure kindness of the heart, the Southeast Asian countries do appreciate that they're able to have trade with China, as just Xi's visit to Malaysia and the others in the region just recently again proved. All China needs to do is not to bully others. And the United States will do the rest for them. So in a sense, it's kind of tragic. And again, in the past, the United States undermined its own system, but it undermined it usually with certain goals. And then at the moment, it seems that it's undermining it out of panic and out of a lack of strategic vision of where the country should go. Although if you ask Donald Trump, then he has a strategic vision, and the strategic vision is well, I mean, he does the tariffs also in order to bring back industry and to strengthen the United States from within, and he doesn't want these regime change operations. I mean, there is a vision, but I'm not sure that he has a long-term goal. And he signals it very, very absurdly, right? Saying being the reserve currency of the world is a huge cost and is very bad for us, and we want others to pay. But at the same time, saying we will never give up being a reserve currency, and if you try to replace the US dollar, then we're gonna give you tariffs. It's like, okay, so So I do think these contradictions are now bringing down the US, and it proves right the people who used to say that the only country in the world with the power to defeat the United States is the United States. Yeah. I think they're in that process now.
It's malevolent destruction of your own country in many ways. You know, it's their Brexit moment, Pascal. But what you say actually is now resonating across Europe, which is really interesting. There is this new cycle of European awakening. As you rightly say, part of it is unfortunately hidden in secularization of that awakening. But there is now final recognition that actually the water between Europe and the United States is now so muddy that you can't see clarity any longer. And I think that will have implications, one of which is an EU Central Asian summit, which I found interesting. I take your point that that's probably symbolic, but the fact that Europe recognizes, there is actually a bit between Russia and China. Let's see what they're about. But that wasn't my question for you, Pascal. I want to pose my final question, looking at what are, if you like, problem states of very different kinds, right? Mm. I mean, now the MAGA bullies have now washed their hands off of African continent completely. So that's open season for Russia and for China, very clearly. And the Americans will pay a very heavy price for that in future. But there are just a handful of countries which are very interesting in this emerging disorder. North Korea, you've dealt with that one, I think, very well. There is Iran, there is Vietnam, and there is Turkey. Very different beasts in their own right that I think MAGA bullies would like to tame. The Vietnamese are caught between the rock and the hard place in many ways. The Iranians may have very few options, but they feel that they've got, the back is covered by Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS Plus and so on. And Turkey is a member of NATO. So they're all very different, but they're all posing challenges to mega bullies. How do you see the interactions between these 3 or 4 countries, if you include North Korea as well, and mega bullism through these kind of middle power countries?
Well, I mean, one of the greatest winners actually of this new constellation, I believe, is North Korea. It was completely, utterly isolated, and now it's actually coming out of that. And it's the new relationship with Russia is in my view going to be a big plus for North Korea. Iran has a new relationship with Russia, and the Vietnam is very intelligently trying to play with all players that it can. I mean, let's not forget 2 years ago, or 1 year ago, Joe Biden was in Hanoi and celebrated a great new, security, strategic partner level with Vietnam, and was shaking hands with a man who back in the days was fighting the Americans in the trenches. And of course, Vietnam it's North Vietnam, right? That one. Today's Vietnam is North Vietnam. So in a sense, I mean, they are being extremely pragmatic. Right now, they try to negotiate with the Americans. They try to do what they can, and each one of these countries has its different strategic challenges. I think the gravest one at the moment is toward Iran, because the US and Israel are openly threatening military action, which is something that, in my view, needs to be avoided at all costs. And this is where I see, for the Middle East or for West Asia, the greatest threat is, of course, this theocratic, ethno-nationalist, fascist state that's called Israel, that wreaks havoc in its own environment time and time again, and actually does so with the support of Europe and the United States. And I find this very, very scary, but it is one of the realities that needs to be taken into account, and especially for a place like Iran. So I admire Iran very much, because it has been able not to have a war, while the provocations to Iran over the last couple of years were immense. Not just starting with, but just let's go back to the assassination of of Mr. Soleimani in Baghdad under the Trump administration, and how they managed to shoot back without hitting anyone. Let's think about the assassination of Palestinian leaders in Tehran, and the Israeli attack on Iran's consulate or embassy in Syria. Like serious, very, very grave breaches of international law between states, right? That though Iran time and again didn't let just pass, but managed to keep under the threshold of open warfare. So I do hope that this streak of genius continues, and that all-out war can be avoided, because that is a huge threat to the security of everybody in that area. I mean, it would be a war with Iran would be even worse than, in terms of dying, in terms of the people killed, than the 1.5 year genocide, massive genocide that we've been seeing. Right, we would have even more people dead, and I hope that remains under the lid. But my prediction is that these countries are going to all focus on their own strategic interests, and then try to cooperate with others in similar situations where they can, and oppose others where they must. But it's more of a it's going to be a much more bilaterally focused moment from here on, than working through a lot of multilateral institutions, as used to be the case especially under the unipolar moment. So I foresee much more bilateral, the flourishing of more bilateral deals and agreements, treaties among states, even among unlikely places. So Iran and Saudi Arabia are getting closer and closer, and well, that's a good thing, right? So we want to de-escalate tensions where we can, and so I think the ways that international politics happens is refocusing on bilateralism rather than multilateral institutions, with exceptions. But even the BRICS is a loose club, not a hard one. So maybe that's the big difference to how things used to work in the 90s and 2000s.
Pascal, we normally close with your piece of advice for cinephobes and cinephiles. And although the fact that you have shared this in your previous presence and appearance on our program, the world has changed. So any new advice for the cinephobes and the cinephiles under the current mad state of affairs?
Just be nice to each other, for God's sake. Like, seriously, it's not that hard. And if you don't like somebody, then talk it out with them. It's our propensity to do stupid stuff just because we get mad is quite amazing. And by the way, the logic of war tries to prevent people from talking with each other. So if you want to do something against war, do something for dialogue, do something for talking, and refuse to break down relations. Even with those you hate. I mean, with those people, maybe even more. You're supposed to seek dialogue. Although I do admit this is extremely hard to do. But that's the ideal we should have. So thank you for that.
Pascal, you've really taken us on a grand tour of a world now on the brink, really, of change, and it's unclear to me how that change is going to settle down. It'll take many years, but you've outlined the kind of the contours of that, both good and bad and neutral. I should throw in the conversation as well. And for that, it's extraordinary to have your insights on balance of discussion, not balance of power, which is what your balance of dialogue, if you like, which is what you're impressing upon us. I hope that the American electorate wakes up to the chaos that the leaders are creating, because I find the whole of the rest of us actually hostage to their lack of understanding of the world in which America finds itself. And you rightly pointed to the tensions that they've generated, and that they are the ones who will suffer and will take the rest of us probably down with them. So I hope they listen to you and I hope they learn from you, and the final advice that you gave is talk, particularly with your enemies. And that is a profound message for us to take from you and then to broadcast. So thank you very much indeed, Pascal, for being our Alum 2.0.
Thank you
Lovely
both.
to have you back, Pascal. Thank you.
Thank you.